Hi, I'm Drew Moller from the Sport and Performance Psychology program at University of Denver. Today I'm going to be talking about peer-created motivational climate and persistence in sport. So it's kind of like a general foundation for the subject. It's important in order to get the benefits that your sport can provide for people, obviously, to stay in the sport. Nowadays, there's a lot of kids drop out for multiple reasons. So it's important that they're persistent in their engagement with it. Studying the factors that will affect that persistence is important for the reason I just mentioned. It's essential in order for people to stay engaged and in order to receive what they could get out of sports. So there are some common elements that are related to persistence in sport. These include things like autonomy, competence, relatedness, intrinsic motivation, and social factors. So some of these things you can think of examples for how they affect sport. If somebody feels competent, that is, if they feel good about their ability in sport, they're going to be more likely to continue. Also, some social factors that might affect persistence in sport would be relationship with the coach, relationship with the rest of your teammates, and that sort of thing. The most important thing here is that these elements can be encouraged through the team's motivational climate. And motivational climate involves things like the norms on the team, the values, and kind of their ways of interacting with one another, with the team's ways of interacting, and with interacting with the coach. So there's been a lot of studies done on the impact of the coach or leader-created motivational climate. There's been much fewer done in terms of the peer-created motivational climate. And the difference being that the motivational climate is either imposed by the coach and kind of dictated by the coach, or it's kind of reinforced through the interactions of the peers. So for the study I looked at, they used this general theoretical framework and looked at Balleron's motivational sequence. Basically says that social factors begin the sequence of developing motivation, and they move on to psychological mediators. So the development of these psychological qualities are what end up increasing or decreasing motivation. That motivation then will lead to a consequence. In this case, the case of the study, it was persistence or dropout in sport. They actually plugged in some different theories into this general framework to explain the emergence of motivation and persistence. So for the social factors, they looked at achievement goal theory. That kind of differentiates between task involvement for motivational climate or ego-involved motivational climate. Task involved should increase intrinsic motivation because it's more focused on achievement rather than comparison. So for the psychological factors that are increased through the motivational climate, we'd be looking at self-determination theory, and that involves autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So by increasing those psychological needs that are basic for most people, it's going to increase motivation, namely intrinsic motivation, which has been shown to be related to persistence in sport. So for the study I looked at, it was 424 young athletes. The mean age was around 13. They're from different team sports clubs, basketball, soccer, volleyball. They had all been participated in a team for over a year. So they weren't new to the environment. They were pretty used to what was going on in team climates. It was a prospective study, which means that they took initial measures of psychological factors at the beginning of the study, and then throughout the next year, they measured persistence by determining whether or not someone dropped out of sport during that time. So the psychological factors that they looked at were peer-created motivational climate, we discussed earlier, basic psychological needs, and that would include the competence, autonomy, and relatedness, and intrinsic motivation. Peer-created motivational climate was measured using a questionnaire with the question stem of in this team/training group, most athletes, and you can kind of fill in the blank there. It could be most athletes support one another, or most athletes compete heavily against one another. So that's going to determine whether it's ego or task-oriented. So the findings from the study showed that athletes that persisted longer in sport had higher perceived ratings of a task involving motivational climate, as well as higher perceived ratings of their psychological need satisfaction, and higher perceived intrinsic motivation. So all these things were what was predicted by the general framework, the theoretical framework before. These things were expected. Also, an ego-involving climate was a negative predictor for perceived relatedness, but was unrelated to autonomy or competence. So this basically says that an ego-involved climate based on outcome comparison doesn't necessarily make kids feel worse or like they have less ability, but that's what's important about it, is if they feel relatable to their teammates, if they feel a good connection with them. This study was important because it's one of the first to find support that the peer motivational climate will affect intrinsic motivation indirectly by developing the psychological needs that I discussed. Also, intrinsic motivation positively predicted persistence in sport. So, kind of the point of the theoretical framework was to increase intrinsic motivation, and it was for this specific reason, because it's been found before that intrinsic motivation make people persist longer in sport. So, a discussion of this topic, we need to discuss how does that peer climate affect intrinsic motivation, and we kind of went through this a little earlier, but more specifically, to reiterate, it's the task-involving climate of the peers in terms of they'll encourage one another to reach their own specific process goals. That's going to increase that intrinsic motivation for each of them individually. So they'll be playing because they genuinely want to and not for any outside reason. Now, it's important to talk about the competition and support, both of those aspects together, because on a team and a performance environment, competition is going to be there and is ultimately a good thing, because it'll kind of spur people to strive for more. At the same time, if that's not coupled with the support, then kids may not feel that relatedness aspect. And without that relatedness, even if they do feel confident and autonomous, it's likely that they might not persist. They may end up dropping out of the sport. So, specific implications for coaches. As a coach, you want to encourage communication as well as improvement and support between teammates. And this goes back to fostering competence and autonomy, relatedness. You want to have an open environment where improving is the main goal, and whereas you don't discount achievement goals and outcome goals, but you want everyone to get better. Also, during drills that coaches will inevitably have that encourage competition between teammates, it's a great thing. It gets people fired up. At the same time, you want to make sure there's a camaraderie present during those goals. You want to look for opportunities to provide feedback to your athletes, regardless of the outcome. Look for opportunities to provide feedback for process goals and achieving those goals, so they don't think that the feedback is only contingent on outcome, because ultimately outcome isn't completely under the athlete's control. Also, you don't want to lose sight of the main goal, and that is, in addition to performing well and improving as individuals and as a team, you want to foster an environment where people enjoy being in that environment, enjoy being on the team, so they'll continue to do so. This research really made progress in how peer motivational climate can affect persistence in sport. Like I said, there's a lot that was done on the coach imposing their environment, but it's important to understand the influence that peers can have on one another, and I think everyone's pretty aware of that naturally. Also, this needs to be tested, the results from the study, in different domains, including different skill levels and ages. This was done in 13-year-olds, so it's not necessarily completely applied to all different ages, as well as, it'd be interesting to find, does this apply for elite athletes, and that sort of thing as well. Some potential problems with the study: the perceptions of peer motivational climate of the players may have changed throughout the year, and it was only measured during the beginning of the year. So, it's safe to say that probably fairly steady throughout the year. At the same time, we can't generalize that the climate is going to stay exactly the same throughout the year. Also, the reasons for dropping out for the athletes may not have been entirely under their control. Findings from this study are somewhat contingent upon the fact that those psychological needs of the individual athletes were what ultimately affected their persistence, whereas there were other factors involved, and that's important to keep in mind. Maybe the child's parents had some sort of say in whether they continued or not. I'm assuming they would have some sort of say, as well as different factors outside of sport. Maybe they wanted to try other things. For future research, it'd be really interesting to look at the interaction between the coaches' behaviors and coaches' imposed motivational climate and the peer motivational climate. How the coaches' behaviors can shift that or reinforce that, especially when it comes to looking at those things in combination as they relate to increasing intrinsic motivation and ultimately persistence in sport. Because what we're really after is what keeps kids going in sport, what makes them want to keep going, and what makes them want to stop. So thanks.